This program on the problem of poverty is being presented by the National Economists Club Educational Foundation and the George Washington University. The poverty problem is closely interrelated with four other major problems considered earlier in this series of programs on current economic issues. For example, rapid inflation aggravates the problem of poverty to the extent that incomes of the poor do not rise as fast as prices. Slow economic growth, rising general unemployment, and low productivity aggravate the poverty problem by increasing the difficulties of the poor in obtaining jobs or getting better paying jobs. There are a number of different ways of defining poverty. In the United States, the extent of poverty is usually measured by the numbers of families or persons whose income is below what is called the poverty level. This level for individuals and families of different sizes is computed annually by the federal government. The poverty measure takes into account income from work, pensions, governmental cash assistance, and other sources. This chart shows changes in the poverty level for a non-farm family of four between 1959 and 1985. The poverty level for such a family increased slowly from around $3,000 in 1959 to around $4,000 in 1972 because of increases in consumer prices. The level then started to increase much more rapidly with higher inflation to nearly $10,000 in 1982. It then grew more slowly in 1983, 84, and 85 with the slowdown in inflation. The next chart indicates what's been happening since 1959 to the percent of the U.S. population in poverty. The percentage of the total population in poverty dropped quite steadily from around 22% of the total in 1959 to around 11% in 1973-74. The percentage did not change appreciably from 1974 through 1979, and then increased to around 15% in 1982 and dropped to 14% in 1985. The change in the percentage of the elderly in poverty has been particularly striking, as indicated in the second line of this chart. Their percentage dropped from around 29% in 1966-67 to around 15% in 1974, mainly because of greater benefits under the Social Security program. It then fluctuated around 15% until 1982, and subsequently declined further in 1983 and 1984. The next chart shows what's been happening since 1959 to the absolute number of families in poverty. The total number of families in poverty declined from around 8 million in 1959 to around 5 million in 1969. It then remained around that level during the 1970s and has risen above the 7 million level in the 1980s. In contrast with the total, the number of female householder families followed a quite different pattern. Instead of declining steeply in the 1960s, their number remained quite constant around the 2 million level. The number of female householder families then increased steadily to around 3.5 million in the first half of the 1980s. Their fraction of the total rose from about 1/4 in 1959 to about 1/2 in the 1980s. The problem of poverty in the United States was discussed in November 1986 by a panel of experts with Professor Joseph Cordes of the George Washington University as the moderator.
I'd like to welcome you all to the NEC George Washington University program on poverty in the 1980s. I'm Joseph Cordes, Professor of Economics here at George Washington University, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We have two very distinguished panelists who we have asked to share their views on the subject of poverty with us. On my right, we have Dr. Isabel Sawfill, presently a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, who was formerly a director of the National Commission for Employment Policy. On my right, We have Dr. Robert Reischauer, presently a senior fellow in economics at the Brookings Institution, formerly a deputy director at the Congressional Budget Office. If any one of us were asked what it means to be poor, I think any number of us would be tempted to give something like the following answer. To be poor is to have inadequate income. And unfortunately, this simple definition has two terms that need to be defined considerably more carefully if one is to have a reasonably precise definition of poverty. Those two terms are inadequate and income. Inadequate can either be defined in absolute terms, for example, inadequate to support some minimally acceptable standard of living, or it can be defined in relative terms. One can think one has inadequate income relative to the income of other members of the same society. And depending on which of these conceptions is chosen, then further issues must be resolved with regard to what the minimally adequate standard of living should be if one is to use the absolute definition of poverty, or how much worse must one be relative to others in order to be considered poor if one chooses to use the relative conception of poverty. The definition of income raises further ambiguities. Namely, should income be defined narrowly to include only cash income, or should it be defined more broadly to include various forms of income in kind as well? And in light of these issues, the first question that I would like to ask our panel to comment upon are the following. First, how has poverty been defined in the U.S. for social policy purposes? Secondly, how have our policy judgments about the nature of poverty been incorporated in the way in which we measure it? Third, what are the principal strengths and weaknesses of these measures? And I would like to turn first to Dr. Reischauer to provide some answers to each of these questions.
Thank you.
Dr. Reischauer.
Thank you. When the official poverty measure was first developed in 1964, it was developed as a measure that was neither an absolute one nor a purely relative measure. In other words, it wasn't a measure that scientifically tried to estimate the amount of resources that would be needed to sustain a minimally adequate standard of living in our society. Rather, what was done was a mixture which incorporated a touch of that with a touch of the cultural values and the standard of living that existed at the time the measure was developed. The formulators of this measure took the cost of providing an economy food budget and multiplied this cost by 3. The multiplication by 3 was based on the observation that around 1960 the average low-income family spent roughly a third of its total income on food. Since 1964, the measure of poverty, or the poverty thresholds, have been raised each year in accordance with the increase in the price index, the consumer price index most recently. In theory, this would allow a poverty-level family the ability to buy a common market basket of goods through time. In practice, of course, this wasn't possible because the market basket that is being consumed and produced in America changes over a long period of time, such as the quarter of century that we've been measuring poverty. And one important thing to realize is that the indexation of the poverty index by the consumer price index has meant that the family at the poverty threshold has fallen increasingly behind the rest of our society. And this is why I said it wasn't a pure relative measure. That the rest of our society, or the society in general, has enjoyed an increase in its standard of living over the last 25 years. If you took the family of 4 in 1965 that was just at the poverty level, you would find that it had an income equivalent to 46% of the median family income for all families of size 4. If you took that same family in 1985 that was just at the poverty threshold, size 4, you would find that its income now was only 34% of the median family income for all families of size 4. Let me now say a few words about some of the specific dimensions of the official poverty measure, and this will bring out some of the weaknesses and strengths of the concept as it has been developed. The first thing to note is that the poverty concept is a cash income concept. By this I mean it takes no account of the in-kind benefits that people receive. Most of the attention on in-kind benefits is focused on government-provided in-kind benefits such as food stamps, housing assistance, Medicaid, Medicare, school lunches. But it's important to remember that all of us, and the poor too, get in-kind benefits through the non-government side of our society. Namely, we might have employer-provided health insurance, we might have free parking at the place we work, we might have subsidized meals in the cafeteria of the factory which we work at. None of this is taken account of when we measure people's income. It's solely cash. Second dimension that's important to realize is that this is a pre-tax concept. It measures income before people pay their mandatory taxes to the government. Poor people pay taxes. They pay sales taxes when they buy food and other taxed items, and to the extent that they work, they will have to pay Social Security taxes, and increasingly the low-income population has been faced with paying income taxes. The tax burden on the poor has been going up over the years, although the new tax bill will eliminate it almost entirely. The third dimension of, or factor about the way we measure poverty is to remember that it takes no account of the flow of services one receives from whatever assets a family might have. The most important asset, of course, is owner-occupied housing. So we can have two families with identical cash incomes. One is a renter family, and the other owns outright its own house, and they will be counted as equally well off or equally poor in our statistics, despite the fact that one clearly has a very valuable asset which it is receiving a service from. The fourth important thing to focus on about our poverty measure is that it's a national measure. It does not vary across the various regions, states, neighborhoods of America. A family of four was poor in 1985 in the United States if it had less than $10,990, whether that family lived in high-cost areas such as Boston or rural Nebraska, which we presume to be a cheaper location. The final dimension that I'll mention is that the poverty concept is an annual concept. We measure income for a one-year period. Incomes vary considerably the shorter the period one is looking at. If we chose to measure incomes on a monthly or a quarterly basis, we would find a higher incidence of poverty than if we measure it over a year-long period, because many people are out of work for a month, 2 months, a short period of time, and would be counted as poor for this short period of time. So with that, why don't I stop and see if Belle has anything she'd like to add.
Well, I think that's a pretty good list, and I would basically agree with it. One additional weakness that I think some people might cite is the fact that the poverty data are very much an economic concept. It really is as Joe Cordes said at the beginning, a measure of income inadequacy. And I think there's increased interest nowadays in whether or not the poor are in some way culturally or behaviorally deficient, and what role that plays in poverty. It's really going back to the old debate about whether or not poverty is the result of our economic system and the lack of income that it provides, or whether the fault lies partly in the character of the people involved. And we have this new term, the underclass, which is being applied to try to get at some of these behavioral or attitudinal deficiencies that some people believe are at work. And I do think that although these hypotheses about the underclass have not been resolved, there is merit in talking about some of the non-economic or sociological or cultural dimensions of poverty.
I think I may want to come back to that in the policy session. Thank you. Well, now that we at least have some rough idea of how the problem is defined, at least officially, I'd like to turn to the question of what has been happening to poverty in the United States. And at least three questions come to mind here. The first, to give us some historical context, really, for the remainder of the discussion, what were some of the trends in the official poverty measure between 1960 and the early 1970s? Second question is, was the poverty measure, like so many other measures of social and economic well-being, adversely affected in the 70s and early 1980s? And if so, what were some of the principal factors behind that? And then finally, I guess I'd like the panelists to engage in a little bit of a projection or forecasting and ask them what would be their best guess about the scope and the shape of poverty in the coming decade. For this part of the discussion, I'd like to turn first to Dr. Sawfill.
Well, let me start with the facts about the trends. The poverty rate was 22% back in 1960 and declined to around 12 or 13% by 1970. So that was a big drop that we had during the decade of the 1960s. During the 1970s, it more or less plateaued. It stayed at a pretty stable range of between 11 and 13% throughout the decade of the 1970s. Then in the first half of the 80s, the poverty rate rose to a peak of about of a little over 15% in 1982, and it has declined a bit since then and is currently at 14%. So we can say, as a kind of looking at the overall trends here, that the poverty rate is a lot lower than it was in 1960, but we haven't made much progress since 1970. In fact, the poverty rate is almost as high now as it was at the time the war on poverty began in the mid-1960s. Turning to some of the reasons for these trends, I think the decline in poverty in the 60s and its subsequent plateauing during the 70s reflected the growth of the economy, particularly in the 1960s, where you had very strong economic growth, rising real incomes for everyone, not just the poor, and a falling unemployment rate. The introduction of new means-tested programs, together with the important effects of growing social insurance programs and coverage of the population, played some role in reducing poverty, and especially poverty amongst the elderly, throughout this period, particularly up until about 1980. Working against the positive role of economic growth and of income transfers were two other things. One was demography, particularly the growth of more single-parent families, which has tended to push the poverty rate up. And in addition, rising inequality of earnings that is not fully understood, but which seems to mean that even though the entire economy is growing and average incomes are rising, to the extent that inequality is growing, that offsets the positive effects of improvements in mean income. Turning to the, well, I should say something perhaps about what's happened since 1980, where there I think the reasons why the poverty rate increased again is, first of all, because we had 2 back-to-back recessions. That was a very important reason. Secondly, because there was some budgetary retrenchment, particularly in the area of means-tested programs for the poor. And then, of course, demographic change continued to have a slight adverse effect. But it was mainly the economy and the budgetary retrenchments. As for the future, a great deal is going to depend upon what happens to the economy. If you've got a rosy forecast for the economy, then you can expect to see further declines in the poverty rate. It's particularly sensitive to unemployment rates. For example, if we could cut the unemployment rate from 7% to 5.5%, we could probably take 3.5 million people off the poverty rolls. However, some people believe that economic growth isn't going to be as successful a solution to the poverty problem in the future as it was in the past, because a larger proportion of the poverty population is now made up of female-headed families and other groups who don't have as strong attachment to the labor force as was true of the earlier poverty population.
Let me just add a few things to Belle's comments. The first is that one can expect the poverty rate to remain high as long as we're going to tolerate a 7% unemployment rate, but also one can expect it to be high as long as productivity doesn't improve in the United States. If we're going to tolerate very low rates of productivity growth, then wage increases, real wage increases, can't be very high, and because a lot of the current poverty problem rests with the working population, one can't expect much of an improvement on that front.
Well, now that we have some sense of the nature and magnitude of the poverty problem in the U.S., I'd like to spend the remainder of the discussion on what can be done to deal with the problem. At least as I see it, there's several broad approaches that could be used either separately or perhaps in combination with each other. Perhaps the most obvious approach is to simply try to provide more adequate income to those in need by maintaining and, if necessary, expanding various forms of income transfer programs. Within that broad strategy for dealing with poverty, there appear to be 2 options that present themselves at the moment. The first is basically continued reliance on what we are presently doing, which involves a system based on a combination of cash and in-kind transfer programs, eligibility for which is triggered by having insufficient means and or specific attributes, such as being an unmarried, a single female head of household, being unemployed, being disabled, to mention a few. Another alternative within the cash transfer strategy that has recently been much talked about and I guess implemented in some of the states is to modify the present system to add some kind of work requirement to the list of criteria that an individual would have to satisfy in order to receive transfers. The other traditional alternative to this approach of cash transfers is to, in effect, try to deal with the problem at its source by making it possible for the poor to earn more adequate incomes. And policies for doing this could range from providing daycare for single mothers, if that facilitated their ability to participate in the labor force more effectively, to a variety of structural employment problems, job training programs, trying to reduce the natural rate of unemployment from whatever people think it is, 6%, 7%. I guess Dr. Sawhill has suggested perhaps another branch of this, which is perhaps worrying a bit more about the cultural and behavioral antecedents of poverty, which is something that's just now, I guess, being thought about. And here I'd like to, in no particular order, ask the panel to comment on what they think are the principal advantages and disadvantages of some of these approaches, as well as any that I might have omitted from my list, and then to share with us their thoughts about what they think the shape of anti-poverty policy should be in the coming decade. So which of you would like to go first?
Well, I'll go first, and I'll start with the last question.
Okay.
Which is really, what should the policy response be? And I think Here my answer would be it should be different strokes for different folks. That the causes of poverty are very different for different groups, and therefore the solutions, I think, are quite different. Now, this is quite a different message from the one that you might have heard a panel like this discussing a decade ago, when a lot of support was behind universal negative income tax type proposals, massive uniform income redistribution schemes. Let me go through four different segments of the population and say what I do for each one. First, we have the worthy poor, the traditional worthy poor, the aged, the disabled, the people we aren't concerned about their labor market response to government income maintenance programs. What can be done here? Quite simple, raise the level of government benefits, SSI benefits in particular. About a third of the households that are in poverty now are aged or disabled households, and so this would make a substantial dent. Also, policy response is simply to sit and wait. We have a Social Security system that is gradually becoming fully mature. People with longer earning records and higher incomes, and more of this population will be receiving adequate, above poverty benefits from Social Security and from private pensions. Secondly, there's a group which we might call the transitory poor. The folks who are going through a period of temporary poverty, possibly caused by unemployment. They've been tossed out of their job because of a business cycle, or because of some life cycle change, a divorce, a separation, or a voluntary type of life cycle change, a student. And interestingly enough, about 7% of the households that are in poverty are headed by a student. So we should keep that in mind. What would we do about them? Well, unemployed people, we should do everything we can to lower the national rate of unemployment and facilitate the mobility of people who find themselves in depressed areas that are never going to bounce back, and help them move to areas where the economy is more vital. For people who are abandoned through divorce or separation by the primary income earner in their family, there are a number of policies that rely on stricter enforcement of child support. The state of Wisconsin is experimenting with a plan that mandates higher levels of child support and automatic withholding of that child support from the non-custodial parent's wage. Steps like that would make a significant difference. There's a third group of people, and this is the working poor. These are people who are working full-time at low wages, or as much time as they can given their family responsibilities, and they're coming up short. Their total incomes are below poverty, or they're the people mixed in with this transitory poor population that happen to be in an area where there are no jobs, but they're out looking for the job. What can we do about them? Well, we can raise wages directly through increases in the minimum wage. There are lots of negative repercussions of that, having to do with the inflationary impact and the possible reduction in the number of low-wage jobs that might bring about. And that makes it maybe not as attractive as we thought 10, 15 years ago, but it is important to remember that in the last 5 years since the minimum wage was raised, the real value of the minimum wage has declined by about 26 or 27%. So we've had a rather substantial fall off in its real value. Secondly, we can supplement wages through wage supplement schemes or an earned income tax credit, an expansion of the earned income tax credit, as was done partially in the recent tax bill. We could have the earned income tax credit adjusted for family size, and that might do something to reduce poverty. We can place greater emphasis on human capital, on training programs, on education programs, to make a higher fraction of our population capable of earning, of commanding wages that are non-poverty level wages. That's a long, slow kind of process, but I think it's called for. The last population group is the persistently poor, and these are the ones Bell mentioned at the beginning. The people with little in the way of education or skills and no firm attachment to the labor market, the long-term welfare recipient, the 25-year-old fellow who never has had a job and is cruising around the ghetto neighborhood. What can we do about this group? I think I, along with many people, basically throw up their hands at this point and suggest what might be marginal changes. I personally would transform the current AFDC system into a two-tier program. A first tier, which was basically for 18 months or 2 years, and it was continuation of the current system. No questions asked. If you meet the test, you come in and you receive benefits. At the end of the 18-month, if you're still on, still dependent, a different program would switch in, and this program would have a heavy component of obligation on the part of the recipient. To continue receiving benefits, the recipient would have to engage in some kind of activity in a serious way, and the permissible types of activities would depend on the characteristics of the individual. They might involve basic education, might involve job search, might involve training, might involve work experience, might involve supported work, or what is known as workfare, working in a public sector or private sector job in return for your benefit. But a serious effort to involve the recipient in some kind of activity which society regards as worthwhile and which we believe might provide a path out of poverty. Let me stop at that point.
Well, that's a fairly complete framework and a good one to start some more detailed discussion or debate, perhaps. I might just add a few more comments about the emphasis that I think we'd all like to see, I certainly would like to see, on preventing poverty as opposed to just ameliorating it. We know that giving people income in the form of government benefits is a surefire cure for poverty as long as you keep giving people the money. But I think many of us are hoping that there is some way to move people towards greater self-sufficiency. And the whole emphasis, I think, on work, including some kind of work requirement, is in part motivated by concerns perhaps about malingering or the notion of a quid pro quo. If you want to receive some benefits from the government, you should be willing to work. But I think more importantly is motivated by a desire to move people towards long-term self-sufficiency. And as Bob suggested, not to have a lot of long-term welfare recipients, for example. And there are a lot of experiments going on at the state level now with this approach. Sometimes the programs really are what I would call straight workfare. In other words, they require working off your welfare benefits at a minimum wage job, typically in the public or nonprofit sector. And other approaches are more service-oriented. Many of them are voluntary, as in Massachusetts, where the program has gotten a lot of national attention. They involve providing training and education and job search assistance and supportive services like daycare and transportation, all of which are designed to help people move into the workforce and escape from welfare dependency. The initial results from most of those experiments, which are being very carefully evaluated now, are modestly encouraging. But this approach is certainly not going to be any panacea, and we should be careful not to oversell it. In addition, it's going to cost money if we provide people with services like daycare and training and education. And although the evidence is that that kind of upfront investment can eventually pay for itself in the form of the reduced welfare expenditures, increased tax-paying capacity of the recipients once they become self-sufficient, and so forth, it takes a while for the return on the investment to come in. And it's a little difficult to see right now in this era of budgetary constraints at the federal level how we're going to find the money to make the initially needed investments. Well, rather than keep talking, maybe I should stop and let you raise further questions, or
Okay.
Bob come in.
Well, actually, your last observation touched on a question that was going through my mind, especially as I heard Bob go through a rather ambitious agenda of programs that, if put together, might address the issue, and that is that in the current environment where, at least at the federal level, it's very doubtful that the budgetary resources will be forthcoming. I was wondering if there are some items on this list, for example, that are probably more doable in the near future because they have a minimal kind of a budgetary impact and don't require one to spend a lot of upfront money.
The most obvious one is raising the minimum wage. That's something that the federal government can impose the costs on the private sector and the consumers of the country without officially taking it out of the federal budget. Another related kind of move would be the extension of employer-provided medical benefits to more employees. Many part-time employees, many employees in low-wage industries aren't covered by the same kind of health insurance that the upper and middle classes are. The recent reconciliation bill that passed the Congress and was signed by the President mandated an extension of health insurance to more part-time workers if the firm already was providing this coverage to its upper-income workers. But I don't think we should kid ourselves and expect that there are ways to improve the poverty situation significantly without spending more money. The major problem is not that we have our resources mixed together in the wrong way, and somehow if we could take the tens of billions of dollars we now spend and rearrange them in a new way, poverty would be significantly reduced. That really is not the case. To get more in the way of results, we're going to have to put more money into solving the problem.
I would say that the most cost-effective ways of reducing poverty in a budgetary sense anyway, would first of all be to have better macroeconomic policies. I mentioned what we could get through a decline in the unemployment rate, and it seems to me that if the Congress and the White House could get their act together on reducing budget deficits, and the Federal Reserve felt more comfortable about expanding the economy, and there was less risk due to the structural damage that's currently being done by our macroeconomic policies, we could move the unemployment rate down and we could help the poor along with everyone else. Would also hopefully provide eventually more growth and more revenues with which to fund some of these programs. Secondly, child support reform is a very cost-effective solution to the problem. There have been simulations that suggest that if we were to implement nationally the kind of system that they currently are trying out in the state of Wisconsin that Bob briefly mentioned, You could reduce the poverty gap by as much as 40%, welfare rolls by as much as 50%, and not cost the government anything at all. The issue there is really to what extent absent parents, usually fathers, have the ability to pay the amount of money that the kind of standards now in effect in Wisconsin require. Let me tell you what those standards are so you'll have an idea. The requirement in Wisconsin is that a father, or more technically a non-custodial parent, whether male or female, pay 17% of their income for the support of one child, and that proportion moves up to a high of 34% for 5 or more children. If you had that kind of standard and you could have a good collection batting average on it, you could do a great deal to reduce both poverty and welfare dependency. The other thing that would be helpful is if we could do something about teenage childbearing. Half of AFDC expenditures are for women and their children for whom the first child was born when that woman was a teenager. And apart from the poverty and the welfare costs associated with teenage childbearing, we know this has disastrous consequences for the lives of the people involved. Now, we don't have any surefire solutions, again, for this problem, but it looks like more family planning services, particularly in school-based health clinics, might help some. And that's a very, very cost-effective approach as well.
Something which maybe Bell and I can disagree on, and that is the macroeconomic solution. I agree wholeheartedly that we should reduce the federal deficit and do it as rapidly as possible, and that will lead to all sorts of good results, from ameliorating the farm crisis to helping our balance of payments situation. But in the short run, I'm still enough of a Keynesian to believe that if we either raise taxes or cut government spending, which I think are the only two ways other than smoke and mirrors to make the deficit go down, that the short-run effect will be higher unemployment and, in fact, greater poverty. That the monetary response or the expectational response in the private sector will occur at a lag, and in the short run of a year or two, the situation will get worse rather than better.
I don't think I disagree with that. It's really, unfortunately, I'm sorry.
Let the record show I tried.
It's you got to start taking action now in order to get the solution in progress, and the short-term effects, depending upon what's happening independently in the traded goods sector, how fast, for example, the economies of Japan and West Germany are growing, which might, independently push up our net exports and offset any fiscal restraint. But depending on those kinds of things, the short-run effects could be in the direction you suggested.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for your questions. We enjoyed having you here.